Nerves by Anton Chekhov, translated by Constance Garnett. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Lewis Richardson. Nerves by Anton Chekhov. Dmitry Osipovich Vaksin, the architect, returned from town to his holiday cottage greatly impressed by the spiritualistic séance at which he had been present. As he undressed and got into his solitary bed, Madame Vaksin had gone to an all-night service. He could not help remembering all he had seen and heard. It had not, properly speaking, been a séance at all, but the whole evening had been spent in terrifying conversation. A young lady had begun it by talking, apropos of nothing, about thought-reading. From thought-reading they had passed imperceptibly to spirits, and from spirits to ghosts, from ghosts to people buried alive. A gentleman had read a horrible story of a corpse turning round in the coffin. Vaksin himself had asked for a saucer and shown the young ladies how to converse with spirits. He had called up, among others, the spirit of his deceased uncle, Klavdy Mironich, and had mentally asked him, "Has not the time come for me to transfer the ownership of our house to my wife?" To which his uncle's spirit had replied, "All things are good in their season." There is a great deal in nature that is mysterious and terrible, thought Vaksin as he got into bed. It's not the dead, but the unknown that's so horrible. It struck 1 o'clock. Vaksin turned over on the other side and peeped out from beneath the bedclothes at the blue light of the lamp burning before the holy icon. The flame flickered and cast a faint light on the icon stand and the big portrait of Uncle Klavdy that hung facing his bed. And what if the ghost of Uncle Klavdy should appear this minute? Flashed through Vaksin's mind. But of course that's impossible. Ghosts are, we all know, a superstition, the offspring of undeveloped intelligence. But Vaksin nevertheless pulled the bedclothes over his head and shut his eyes very tight. The corpse that turned round in its coffin came back to his mind, and the figures of his deceased mother-in-law, of a colleague who had hanged himself, and of a girl who had drowned herself rose before his imagination. Vaksin began trying to dispel these gloomy ideas, but the more he tried to drive them away, the more haunting the figures and the fearful fancies became. He began to feel frightened. "Hang it all," he thought. "Here I am, afraid of the dark like a child. Idiotic." Tick, tick, tick. He heard the clock in the next room. The church bell chimed the hour in the graveyard close by. The bell tolled slowly, depressingly, mournfully. A cold chill ran down Vaksin's neck and spine. He fancied he heard someone breathing heavily over his head, as though Uncle Klavdy had stepped out of his frame and was bending over his nephew. Vaksin felt unbearably frightened. He clenched his teeth and held his breath in terror. At last, when a cockchafer flew in at the open window and began buzzing over his head, he could bear it no longer and gave a violent tug at the bell rope. "Dmitry Osipich, was wollen Sie?" He heard the voice of the German governess at his door a moment later. "Ah, it's you, Rosalia Karlovna," Vaksin cried, delighted. "Why do you trouble? Gavrila might just—" "Yourself, Gavrila, to the town sent, and Glafira is all the evening gone. There's nobody in the house. Was wollen Sie doch?" "Well, what I wanted, it's— But please, come in. You needn't mind, it's dark." Rosalia Karlovna, a stout, red-cheeked person, came into the bedroom and stood in an expectant attitude at the door. "Sit down, please. You see, it's like this." What on earth am I to ask her for? He wondered, stealing a glance at Uncle Klavdy's portrait and feeling his soul gradually returning to tranquillity. "What I really want to ask you was— Oh, when the man goes to town, don't forget to tell him to get some cigarette papers. But do, please, sit down." "Cigarette papers? Good. Was wollen Sie noch?" "Ich will. There's nothing I will, but do sit down. I shall think of something else in a minute." "It is shocking for a maiden in a man's room to remain. Mr. Vaksin, you are, I see, a naughty man. I understand. To order cigarette papers when does not a person wake. I understand you." Rosalia Karlovna turned and went out of the room. Somewhat reassured by his conversation with her and ashamed of his cowardice, Vaxin pulled the bedclothes over his head and shut his eyes. For about 10 minutes he felt fairly comfortable. Then the same nonsense came creeping back into his mind. He swore to himself, felt for the matches, and without opening his eyes, lighted a candle. But even the light was no use. To Vaxin's excited imagination it seemed as though someone were peeping round the corner and that his uncle's eyes were moving. "I'll ring her up again. Damn the woman," he decided. "I'll tell her I'm unwell and ask for some drops." Vaxin rang. There was no response. He rang again. As though answering his ring, he heard the church bell toll the hour. Overcome with terror, cold all over, he jumped out of bed, ran headlong out of his bedroom, and making the sign of the cross and cursing himself for his cowardice, he fled barefoot in his nightshirt to the governess's room. "Rosalia Karlovna," he began in a shaking voice as he knocked at her door. "Rosalia Karlovna, are you asleep? I feel so, unwell. Drops." There was no answer. Silence reigned. "I beg you, do you understand? I beg you. Why this squeamishness I can't understand, especially when a man is ill. How absurdly zealic, manialic you are really, at your age. I to your wife shall tell, will not leave an honest maiden in peace. When I was at Baron Anzig's, and the Baron tried to come to me for matches, I understand at once what his matches mean, and tell to the Baroness, I am an honest maiden. Hang your honesty, I am ill, I tell you, and asking you for drops. Do you understand? I am ill. Your wife is an honest good woman, and you ought her to love. Ja, she is noble. I will not be her foe. You are a fool, simply a fool. Do you understand? A fool." Vaxin leaned against the doorpost, folded his arms, and waited for his panic to pass off. To return to his room where the lamp flickered and his uncle stared at him from his frame was more than he could face, and to stand at the governess's door in nothing but his nightshirt was inconvenient from every point of view. What could he do? It struck 2 o'clock, and his terror had not left him. There was no light in the passage, and something dark seemed to be peeping out from every corner. Vaxin turned so as to face the doorpost, but at that instant it seemed as though somebody tweaked his nightshirt from behind and touched him on the shoulder. "Damnation! Rosalia Karlovna!" No answer. Vaxin hesitantly opened the door and peeped into the room. The virtuous German was sweetly slumbering. The tiny flame of a nightlight threw her solid buxom person into relief. Vaxin stepped into the room and sat down on a wickerwork trunk near the door. He felt better in the presence of a living creature, even though that creature was asleep. "Let the German idiot sleep," he thought. "I'll sit here, and when it gets light I'll go back. It's daylight early now." Vaxin curled up on the trunk and put his arm under his head to await the coming of dawn. "What a thing it is to have nerves," he reflected. "An educated, intelligent man, hang it all, it's a perfect disgrace." As he listened to the gentle, even breathing of Rosalia Karlovna, he soon recovered himself completely. At 6 o'clock Vaxin's wife returned from the all-night service, and, not finding her husband in their bedroom, went to the governess to ask her for some change for the cabman. On entering the German's room, a strange sight met her eyes. On the bed lay stretched Rosalia Karlovna, fast asleep, and a couple of yards from her was her husband curled up on the trunk, sleeping the sleep of the just and snoring loudly. What she said to her husband, and how he looked when he awoke, I leave to others to describe. It is beyond my powers. End of Nerves by Anton Chekhov. Recording by David Lewis Richardson.
Doom of the House of Duryea by Earl Pierce, Jr. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Nelson. Doom of the House of Duryea. Arthur Duryea, a young, handsome man, came to meet his father for the first time in 20 years. As he strode into the hotel lobby, long strides which had the spring of elastic in them, idle eyes lifted to appraise him, for he was an impressive figure, somehow grim with exultation. The desk clerk looked up with his habitual smile of expectation. "How do you do, Mr. So-and-so?" and his finger strayed to the green fountain pen which stood in a holder on the desk. Arthur Duryea cleared his throat, but still his voice was clogged and unsteady. To the clerk he said, "I'm looking for my father, Dr. Henry Duryea. I understand he is registered here. He has recently arrived from Paris." The clerk lowered his glance to a list of names. "Dr. Duryea is in Suite 600, 6th floor." He looked up, his eyebrows arched questioningly. "Are you staying too, sir, Mr. Duryea?" Arthur took the pen and scribbled his name rapidly. Without a further word, neglecting even to get his key and own room number, he turned and walked to the elevators. Not until he reached his father's suite on the 6th floor did he make an audible noise, and this was a mere sigh which fell from his lips like a prayer. The man who opened the door was unusually tall, his slender frame clothed in tight-fitting black. He hardly dared to smile. His clean-shaven face was pale, an almost livid whiteness against the sparkle in his eyes. His jaw had a bluish luster. "Arthur." The word was scarcely a whisper. It seemed choked up quietly, as if it had been repeated time and again on his thin lips. Arthur Duryea felt the kindliness of those eyes go through him, and then he was in his father's embrace. Later, when these two grown men had regained their outer calm, they closed the door and went into the drawing-room. The elder Duryea held out a humidor of fine cigars, and his hand shook so hard when he held the match that his son was forced to cup his own hands about the flame. They both had tears in their eyes, but their eyes were smiling. Henry Duryea placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "This is the happiest day of my life," he said. "You can never know how much I have longed for this moment." Arthur, looking into that glance, realized with growing pride that he had loved his father all his life, despite any of those things which had been cursed against him. He sat down on the edge of a chair. I don't know how to act," he confessed. "You surprise me, Dad. You're so different from what I had expected." A cloud came over Dr. Duryea's features. "What did you expect, Arthur?" he demanded quickly. "An evil eye, a shaven head, and knotted jowls?" "Please, Dad, no." Arthur's words clipped short. "I don't think I ever really visualized you. I knew you would be a splendid man, but I thought you'd look older, like a man who has really suffered." "I have suffered, more than I can ever describe. But seeing you again, and the prospect of spending the rest of my life with you, has more than compensated for my sorrows. Even during the 20 years we were apart, I found an ironic joy in learning of your progress in college, and in your American game of football." "Then you've been following my work?" "Yes, Arthur. I've received monthly reports ever since you left me. From my study in Paris, I've been really close to you, working out your problems as if they were my own. And now that the 20 years are completed, the ban which kept us apart is lifted forever. From now on, son, we shall be the closest of companions, unless your Aunt Cecilia has succeeded in her terrible mission." The mention of that name caused an unfamiliar chill to come between the two men. It stood for something, in each of them, which gnawed their minds like a malignancy. But to the younger Duryea, in his intense effort to forget the awful past, her name as well as her madness must be forgotten. He had no wish to carry on this subject of conversation, for it betrayed an internal weakness which he hated. With forced determination and a ludicrous lift of his eyebrows, he said, "Cecilia is dead, and her silly superstition is dead also. From now on, Dad, we're going to enjoy life as we should. Bygones are really bygones in this case." Dr. Duryea closed his eyes slowly, as though an exquisite pain had gone through him. "Then you have no indignation?" he questioned. "You have none of your aunt's hatred?" "Indignation? Hatred?" Arthur laughed aloud. "Ever since I was 12 years old I have disbelieved Cecilia's stories. I have known that those horrible things were impossible, that they belonged to the ancient category of mythology and tradition. How then can I be indignant, and how can I hate you? How can I do anything but recognize Cecilia for what she was, a mean, frustrated woman, cursed with an insane grudge against you and your family? I tell you, Dad, that nothing she has ever said can possibly come between us again." Henry Duryea nodded his head. His lips were tight together, and the muscles in his throat held back a cry. In that same soft tone of defense, he spoke further, doubting words. "Are you so sure of your subconscious mind, Arthur? Can you be so certain that you are free from all suspicion, however vague? Is there not a lingering premonition, a premonition which warns of peril?" "No, Dad, no!" Arthur shot to his feet. "I don't believe it. I've never believed it. I know, as any sane man would know, that you are neither a vampire nor a murderer. You know it too, and Cecilia knew it, only she was mad. That family rot is dispelled, Father. This is a civilized century. Belief in vampirism is sheer lunacy. Why, it's too absurd even to think about." "You have the enthusiasm of youth," said his father in a rather tired voice. "But have you not heard the legend?" Arthur stepped back instinctively. He moistened his lips, for their dryness might crack them. "The legend?" He said the word in a curious hush of awed softness, as he had heard his Aunt Cecilia say it many times before. "That awful legend that I eat my children?" "Oh, God, Father!" Arthur went to his knees as a cry burst through his lips. "Dad, that's ghastly. We must forget Cecilia's ravings." "You are affected, then?" asked Dr. Duryea bitterly. "Affected? Certainly I'm affected, but only as I should be at such an accusation. Cecilia was mad, I tell you. Those books she showed me years ago, and those folk tales of vampires and ghouls, they burned into my infantile mind like acid. They haunted me day and night in my youth, and caused me to hate you worse than death itself. But in heaven's name, Father, I've outgrown those things, as I have outgrown my clothes. I am a man now. Do you understand that? A man with a man's sense of logic." "Yes, I understand." Henry Duryea threw his cigar into the fireplace and placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "We shall forget Cecilia," he said. "As I told you in my letter, I have rented a lodge in Maine where we can go to be alone for the rest of the summer. We'll get in some fishing and hiking and perhaps some hunting. But first, Arthur, I must be sure in my own mind that you are sure in yours. I must be sure you won't bar your door against me at night and sleep with a loaded revolver at your elbow. I must be sure that you're not afraid of going up there alone with me and dying." His voice ended abruptly, as if an age-long dread had taken hold of it. His son's face was waxen, with sweat standing out like pearls on his brow. He said nothing, but his eyes were filled with questions which his lips could not put into words. His own hand touched his father's and tightened over it. Henry Duryea drew his hand away. "I'm sorry," he said, and his eyes looked straight over Arthur's lowered head. "This thing must be thrashed out now. I believe you when you say that you discredit Cecilia's stories. But for a sake greater than sanity, I must tell you the truth behind the legend. And believe me, Arthur, there is a truth." He climbed to his feet and walked to the window which looked out over the street below. For a moment he gazed into space, silent. Then he turned and looked down at his son. You have heard only your aunt's version of the legend, Arthur. Doubtless it was warped into a thing far more hideous than it actually was, if that is possible. Doubtless she spoke to you of the inquisitorial stake in Carcassonne, where one of my ancestors perished. Also, she may have mentioned that book, Vampires, which a former Duryea is supposed to have written. Then certainly she told you about your 2 younger brothers, my own poor motherless children, who were sucked bloodless in their cradles. Arthur Duryea passed a hand over his aching eyes. Those words, so often repeated by that witch of an aunt, stirred up the same visions which had made his childhood nights sleepless with terror. He could hardly bear to hear them again, and from the very men to whom they were accredited. "Listen, Arthur," the elder Duryea went on quickly, his voice low with the pain it gave him. "You must know that true basis to your aunt's hatred. You must know of that curse of vampirism, which is supposed to have followed the Duryeas through 5 centuries of French history, but which we can dispel as pure superstition, so often connected with ancient families. But I must tell you that this part of the legend is true. Your 2 younger brothers actually died in their cradles, bloodless, and I stood trial in France for their murder, and my name was smirched throughout all of Europe with such an inhuman damnation that it drove your aunt and you to America and has left me childless, hated, and ostracized from society the world over. I must tell you that on that terrible night in Duryea Castle I had been working late on historic volumes of Crespet and Prynne, and on that loathsome tome, Vampires. I must tell you of the soreness that was in my throat, and of the heaviness of the blood which coursed through my veins, and of that presence, which was neither man nor animal, but which I knew was some place near me, yet neither within the castle nor outside of it, and which was closer to me than my heart, and more terrible to me than the touch of the grave. I was at the desk in my library, my head swimming in a delirium which left me senseless until dawn. There were nightmares that frightened me, Arthur, a grown man who had dissected countless cadavers in morgues and medical schools. I know that my tongue was swollen in my mouth, and that brine moistened my lips, and that a rottenness pervaded my body like a fever. I can make no recollection of sanity or of consciousness. That night remains vivid, unforgettable, yet somehow completely in shadows. When I had fallen asleep, if in God's name it was sleep, I was slumped across my desk, and when I awoke in the morning, I was lying face down on my couch. So, you see, Arthur, I had moved during that night, and I had never known it. What I'd done and where I'd gone during those dark hours will always remain an impenetrable mystery. But I do know this. On the morrow I was torn from my sleep by the shrieks of maids and butlers, and by that mad wailing of your aunt. I stumbled through the open door of my study, and in the nursery I saw those 2 babies there, lifeless, white, and dry like mummies, and with twin holes in their necks that were caked black with their own blood. Oh, I don't blame you for your incredulousness, Arthur. I cannot believe it yet myself, nor shall I ever believe it. The belief of it would drive me to suicide, and still the doubting of it drives me mad with horror. All of France was doubtful, and even the savants who defended my name at the trial found that they could not explain it nor disbelieve it. The case was quieted by the Republic, for it might have shaken science to its very foundation and split the pedestals of religion and logic. I was released from the charge of murder, but the actual murder was hung about me like a stench. The coroners who examined those tiny cadavers found them both dry of all their blood, but could find no blood on the floor of the nursery, nor in the cradles. Something from hell stalked the halls of Duryea that night, and I should blow my brains out if I dared to think deeply of who that was. You, too, my son, would have been dead and bloodless if you hadn't been sleeping in a separate room with your door barred on the inside. You were a timid child, Arthur. You were only 7 years old, but you were filled with the folklore of those mad Lombards and the decadent poetry of your aunt. On that same night, while I was someplace between heaven and hell, you also heard the padded footsteps on the stone corridor, and heard the tugging at your door handle, for in the morning you complained of a chill and of terrible nightmares which frighten you in your sleep. I only thank God that your door was barred." Henry Duryea's voice choked into a sob which brought the stinging tears back into his eyes. He paused to wipe his face and to dig his fingers into his palm. "You understand, Arthur, that for 20 years, under my sworn oath at the Palace of Justice, I could neither see you nor write to you. 20 years, my son, while all of that time you had grown to hate me and to spit at my name. Not until your aunt's death have you called yourself a Duryea, and now you come to me at my bidding and say you love me as a son should love his father. Perhaps it is God's forgiveness for everything. Now at last we shall be together, and that terrible, unexplainable past will be buried forever." He put his handkerchief back into his pocket and walked slowly to his son. He dropped to one knee, and his hands gripped Arthur's arms. "My son, I can say no more to you. I have told you the truth as I alone know it. I may be, by all accounts, some ghoulish creation of Satan on earth. I may be a child-killer, a vampire, some morbidly diseased specimen of Rhacolacus, things which science cannot explain. Perhaps the dreaded legend of the Duryeas is true. Latrielle Duryea was convicted of murdering his brother in that same monstrous fashion in the year 1576, and he died in flames at the stake. Francois Duryea, in 1802, blew his head apart with a blunderbuss on the morning after his youngest son was found dead, apparently from anemia. And there are others, of whom I cannot bear to speak, that would chill your soul if you were to hear them. So, you see, Arthur, there is a hellish tradition behind our family. There is a heritage which no sane God would ever have allowed. The future of the Duryeas lies in you, for you are the last of the race. I pray with all of my heart that Providence will permit you to live your full share of years, and to leave other Duryeas behind you. And so, if ever again I feel that presence as I did in Duryea Castle, I am going to die as Francois Duryea died over 100 years ago." He stood up, and his son stood up at his side. "If you are willing to forget, Arthur, we shall go up to that lodge in Maine. There is a life we've never known awaiting us. We must find that life, and we must find the happiness which a curious fate snatched from us on those Lombard sourlands 20 years ago." 2. Henry Duryea's tall stature, coupled with a slenderness of frame and a sleekness of muscle, gave him an appearance that was unusually gaunt. His son couldn't help but think of that word as he sat on the rustic porch of the lodge, watching his father sunning himself at the lake's edge. Henry Duryea had a kindliness in his face, at times an almost sublime kindliness which great prophets often possess. But when his face was partly in shadows, particularly about his brow, there was a frightening tone which came into his features. For it was a tone of farness, of mysticism and conjuration. Somehow, in the late evenings, he assumed the unapproachable mantle of a dreamer and sat silently before the fire, his mind ever off in unknown places. In that little lodge there was no electricity, and the glow of the oil lamps played curious tricks with the human expression which frequently resulted in something unhuman. It may have been the dusk of night, the flickering of the lamps, but Arthur Duryea had certainly noticed how his father's eyes had sunken further into his head, and how his cheeks were tighter and the outline of his teeth pressed into the skin about his lips. It was nearing sundown on the second day of their stay at Timber Lake. 6 miles away, the dirt road wound down toward Houtland, near the Canadian border. So it was lonely there, on a solitary little lake hemmed in closely with dark evergreens and a sky which drooped low over dusty summited mountains. Within the lodge was a homey fireplace and a glossy elk's head which peered out over the mantel. There were guns and fishing tackle on the walls, shelves of reliable American fiction, Mark Twain, Melville, Stockton, and a well-worn edition of Bret Harte. A fully supplied kitchen and a wood stove furnished them with hearty meals which were welcome after a whole day's tramp in the woods. On that evening, Henry Duryea prepared a select French stew out of every available vegetable and a can of soup. They ate well, then stretched out before the fire for a smoke. They were outlining a trip to the Orient together when the back door blew open with a terrific bang, and a wind swept into the lodge with a coldness which chilled them both. "A storm," Henry Duryea said, rising to his feet. "Sometimes they have them up here, and they're pretty bad. The roof might leak over your bedroom. Perhaps you'd like to sleep down here with me." His fingers strayed playfully over his son's head as he went out into the kitchen to bar the swinging door. Arthur's room was upstairs, next to a spare room filled with extra furniture. He'd chosen it because he liked the altitude, and because the only other bedroom was occupied. He went upstairs swiftly and silently. His roof didn't leak. It was absurd even to think it might. It had been his father again, suggesting that they sleep together. He had done it before, in a jesting, whispering way, as if to challenge them both if they dared to sleep together. Arthur came back downstairs dressed in his bathrobe and slippers. He stood on the 5th stair, rubbing a 2 days' growth of beard. "I think I'll shave tonight," he said to his father. "May I use your razor?" Henry Duryea, draped in a black raincoat and with his face haloed in the brim of a rain hat, looked up from the hall. A frown glided obscurely from his features. "Not at all, son. Sleeping upstairs?" Arthur nodded and quickly said, "Are you going out?" "Yes, I'm going to tie the boats up tighter. I'm afraid the lake will rough it up a bit." Duryea jerked back the door and stepped outside. The door slammed shut, and his footsteps sounded on the wood flooring of the porch. Arthur came slowly down the remaining steps. He saw his father's figure pass across the dark rectangle of a window, saw the flash of lightning that suddenly printed his grim silhouette against the glass. He sighed deeply, a sigh which burned in his throat. For his throat was sore and aching. Then he went into the bedroom, found the razor lying in plain view on a birch tabletop. As he reached for it, his glance fell upon his father's open Gladstone bag which rested at the foot of the bed. There was a book resting there, half hidden by a gray flannel shirt. It was a narrow, yellow-bound book, oddly out of place. Frowning, he bent down and lifted it from the bag. It was surprisingly heavy in his hands, and he noticed a faintly sickening odor of decay which drifted from it like a perfume. The title of the volume had been thumbed away into an indecipherable blur of gold letters. But pasted across the front cover was a white strip of paper on which was typewritten the word Infantafagi. He flipped back the cover and ran his eyes over the title page. The book was printed in French, and early French, yet to him wholly comprehensible. The publication date was 1580 in Caen. Breathlessly, he turned back a second page, saw a chapter headed Vampires. He slumped to one elbow across the bed. His eyes were 4 inches from those mildewed pages, his nostrils reeked with the stench of them. He skipped long paragraphs of pedantic jargon on theology. He scanned brief accounts of strange, blood-eating monsters, vrykolaches and leprechauns. He read Jeanne d'Arc, of Ludwig Prynne, and muttered aloud the Latin snatches from Episcopi. He passed pages in quick succession, his fingers shaking with the fear of it and his eyes hanging heavily in their sockets. He saw a vague reference to Enoch and saw the terrible drawings by an ancient Dominican of Rome. Paragraph after paragraph he read, the horror-striking testimony of Nider's Ant Hill, the testimony of people who died shrieking at the stake, the recitals of grave-tenders, of jurists and hangmen. Then, unexpectedly, among all of this monumental vestige, there appeared before his eyes the name of Latrielle Duryea, and he stopped reading as though invisibly struck. Thunder clapped near the lodge and rattled the window panes. The deep rolling of bursting clouds echoed over the valley. But he heard none of it. His eyes were on those 2 short sentences which his father, someone, had underlined with dark red crayon. The execution 4 years ago of Latrielle Duryea does not end the Duryea controversy. Time alone can decide whether the demon has claimed that family from its beginning to its end. Arthur read on about the trial of Latrielle Duryea before Veniti, the Carcassinian Inquisitor General, read with mounting horror the evidence which had sent that far-gone Duryea to the pillar, the evidence of a bloodless corpse who had been Latrielle Duryea's younger brother. Unmindful now of the tremendous storm which had centered over Timber Lake, unheeding the clatter of windows and the swish of pines on the roof, even of his father who worked down at the lake's edge in a drenching rain, Arthur fastened his glance to the blurred print of those pages, sinking deeper and deeper into the garbled legends of a dark age. On the last page of the chapter, he again saw the name of his ancestor, Latrielle Duryea. He traced a shaking finger over the narrow lines of words, and when he finished reading them, he rolled sideways on his bed, and from his lips came a sobbing, mumbling prayer. God, oh God in heaven, protect me. For he had read, as in the case of Latrielle Duryea, we observe that this specimen of Rhacolacus preys only upon the blood in its own family. It possesses none of the characteristics of the undead vampire, being usually a living male person of otherwise normal appearances, unsuspecting its inherent demonism. But this Rhacolacus cannot act according to its demoniacal possession unless it is in the presence of a second member of the same family, who acts as a medium between the man and its demon. This medium has none of the traits of the vampire, but it senses the being of this creature, when the metamorphosis is about to occur, by reason of intense pains in the head and throat. Both the vampire and the medium undergo similar reactions, involving nausea, nocturnal visions, and physical disquietude. When these 2 outcasts are within a certain distance of each other, the coalescence of inherent demonism is completed, and the vampire is subject to its attacks, demanding blood for its sustenance. No member of the family is safe at these times, for the Rhacolacus, acting in its true agency on Earth, will unerringly seek out the blood. In rare cases, where other victims are unavailable, the vampire will even take blood from the very medium which made it possible. This vampire is born into certain aged families, and naught but death can destroy it. It is not conscious of its blood madness and acts only in a psychic state. The medium also is unaware of its terrible role, and when these 2 are together, despite any lapse of years, the fusion of inheritance is so violent that no power known on earth can turn it back. 3. The lodge door slammed shut with a sudden, interrupting bang. The lock grated, and Henry Duryea's footsteps sounded on the planked floor. Arthur shook himself from the bed. He had only time to fling that haunting book into the Gladstone bag before he sensed his father standing in the doorway. You're not shaving, Arthur." Duryea's words, spliced hesitantly, were toneless. He glanced from the tabletop to the Gladstone and to his son. He said nothing for a moment, his glance inscrutable. Then, It's blowing up quite a storm outside." Arthur swallowed. The first words which had come into his throat, nodded quickly. "Yes, isn't it? Quite a storm." He met his father's gaze, his face burning. I don't think I'll shave, Dad. My head aches." Duryea came swiftly into the room and pinned Arthur's arms in his grasp. "What do you mean, your head aches? How? Does your throat—" "No." Arthur jerked himself away. He laughed. "It's that French stew of yours. It's hit me in the stomach." He stepped past his father and started up the stairs. "The stew?" Duryea pivoted on his heel. "Possibly. I think I feel it myself." Arthur stopped, his face suddenly white. "You, too?" The words were hardly audible. Their glances met, clashed like dueling swords. For 10 seconds, neither of them said a word or moved a muscle. Arthur, from the stairs, looking down, his father below, gazing up at him. In Henry Duryea, the blood drained slowly from his face and left a purple etching across the bridge of his nose and above his eyes. He looked like a death's head. Arthur winced at the sight and twisted his eyes away. He turned to go up the remaining stairs. "Son!" He stopped again, his hand tightened on the banister. "Yes, Dad?" Duryea put his foot on the first stair. "I want you to lock your door tonight. The wind would keep it banging." "Yes," breathed Arthur, and pushed up the stairs to his room. Dr. Duryea's hollow footsteps sounded in steady, unhesitant beats across the floor of Timber Lake Lodge. Sometimes they stopped, and the crackling hiss of a sulphur match took their place. Then perhaps a distended sigh, and again footsteps. Arthur crouched at the open door of his room. His head was cocked for those noises from below. In his hands was a double-barrel shotgun of violent gauge. Thud, thud, thud. Then a pause, the clinking of a glass and the gurgling of liquid. The sigh, the tread of his feet over the floor. "He's thirsty," Arthur thought. "Thirsty." Outside, the storm had grown into fury. Lightning zigzagged between the mountains, filling the valley with weird phosphorescence. Thunder, like drums, rolled incessantly. Within the lodge, the heat of the fireplace piled the atmosphere thick with stagnation. All the doors and windows were locked shut. The oil lamps glowed weakly, a pale, anemic light. Henry Duryea walked to the foot of the stairs and stood looking up. Arthur sensed his movements and ducked back into his room, the gun gripped in his shaking fingers. Then Henry Duryea's footsteps sounded on the first stair. Arthur slumped to one knee. He buckled a fist against his teeth as a prayer tumbled through them. Duryea climbed a second step, and another, and still one more. On the fourth stair, he stopped. "Arthur." His voice cut into the silence like the crack of a whip. "Arthur, will you come down here?" "Yes, Dad." Bedraggled, his body hanging like cloth, young Duryea took 5 steps to the landing. "We can't be zanies," cried Henry Duryea. "My soul is sick with dread. Tomorrow we're going back to New York. I'm going to get the first boat to open sea. Please, come down here." He turned about and descended the stairs to his room. Arthur choked back the words which had lumped in his mouth. Half dazed, he followed. In the bedroom, he saw his father stretched face up along the bed. He saw a pile of rope at his father's feet. "Tie me to the bedposts, Arthur," came the command. "Tie both my hands and both my feet." Arthur stood gaping. "Do as I tell you!" "Dad, what Don't be a fool! You read that book. You know what relation you are to me. I'd always hoped it was Cecilia, but now I know it's you. I should have known it on that night 20 years ago, when you complained of a headache and nightmares. Quickly, my head rocks with pain. Tie me!" Speechless, his own pain piercing him with agony, Arthur fell to that grisly task. Both hands he tied, and both feet, tied them so firmly to the iron posts that his father could not lift himself an inch off the bed. Then he blew out the lamps, and without a further glance at that Prometheus, he reascended the stairs to his room and slammed and locked his door behind him. He looked once at the breech of his gun and set it against a chair by his bed. He flung off his robe and slippers, and within 5 minutes he was senseless in slumber. 4. He slept late, and when he awakened his muscles were as stiff as boards, and the lingering visions of a nightmare clung before his eyes. He pushed his way out of bed, stood dazedly on the floor. A dull, numbing cruciation circulated through his head. He felt bloated, coarse and running with internal mucus. His mouth was dry, his gums sore and stinging. He tightened his hands as he lunged for the door. "Dad!" he cried, and he heard his voice breaking in his throat. Sunlight filtered through the window at the top of the stairs. The air was hot and dry, and carried in it a mild odor of decay. Arthur suddenly drew back at that odor, drew back with a gasp of awful fear, for he recognized it, that stench, the heaviness of his blood, the rawness of his tongue and gums. Age-long it seemed, yet rising like a spirit in his memory. All of these things he had known and felt before. He leaned against the banister and half slid, half stumbled down the stairs. His father had died during the night. He lay like a waxen figure tied to his bed, his face done up in knots. Arthur stood dumbly at the foot of the bed for only a few seconds. Then he went back upstairs to his room. Almost immediately, he emptied both barrels of the shotgun into his head. The tragedy at Timber Lake was discovered accidentally 3 days later. A party of fishermen, upon finding the 2 bodies, notified state authorities, and an investigation was directly underway. Arthur Duryea had undoubtedly met death at his own hands. The condition of his wounds and the manner with which he held the lethal weapon at once foreclosed the suspicion of any foul play. But the death of Dr. Henry Duryea confronted the police with an inexplicable mystery, for his trussed-up body, unscathed except for 2 jagged holes over the jugular vein, had been drained of all its blood. The autopsy protocol of Henry Duryea laid death to undetermined causes, and it was not until the yellow tabloids commenced an investigation into the Duryea family history that the incredible and fantastic explanations were offered to the public. Obviously, such talk was held in popular contempt. Yet, in view of the controversial war which followed, the authorities considered it expedient to consign both Duryeas to the crematory. The End of Doom of the House of Duryea by Earl Price, Jr. Cold Ghost by Chester S. Geyer. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, visit LibriVox.org. Reading by Mark Nelson. Cold Ghost. In the valley, with the sheltering hills now behind them, the bitterly cold wind drove at the sled with unchecked ferocity. Gusts of snow came with the wind, thick and dry, the separate particles of it stinging on contact. The dogs made slow progress through the deep drifts. Hager's smoldering irritation blazed into abrupt rage. From his position at the rear of the sled, he lashed out with the driver's whip that he held in one heavily mittened hand, shouting behind the wool scarf covering the lower half of his face. The dogs lunged in their traces, whining. A couple floundered in the powdery footing and were immediately snapped at by their companions behind them. The snow was falling swiftly and with a sinister steadiness. It seemed to hang like a vast white curtain over the valley, obscuring the hills and the fanged outline of the mountains beyond. The wind seized portions of the curtain and twisted it into fantastic shapes. The shapes of demons, Hager thought suddenly. For the scene through which he moved was a kind of hell, a white and frozen hell, with the howl of the wind like the despairing shrieks of tormented souls. Hager pictured himself as one of them, and Cahill, huddled in furs on the sled, another. He cursed behind the scarf as he thought of Cahill. This was Cahill's fault, their being out here in the storm. If it weren't for Cahill, he would be back at the cabin, snug and warm, logs blazing cheerfully in the fireplace. It was a rotten time for Cahill to have taken sick, Hager fumed. But it had happened, and it had left him with nothing else to do but pack their catch of furs, harness up the sled, and start out with Cahill for the doctor in Moose Gulch. He almost regretted having taken the furs. With Cahill an added burden on the sled, it was too large a load for the dogs to pull with the necessary speed and endurance. But he hadn't dared to leave the entire season's catch unguarded at the cabin. If some wanderer appeared in his and Cahill's absence, the furs would be an irresistible temptation. Fearing thus to leave the furs behind, and now endangered by their weight, Hager found the situation maddening. And the storm was making matters worse. It was near the end of winter, but the climate had chosen this moment to be at its most uncooperative. Hager muttered blackly against the storm, wondering why he had allowed his trapper's dream of wealth to lure him to this far northern corner of Alaska. It was a cold, bleak, and hostile country. Tiny settlements, like Moose Gulch, were few and far between. Of course, furs were at their best and most plentiful here. He and Cahill had proved that, for their catch was a large one. Hager's thoughts soared briefly above his bitter mood as he thought of the money the furs would bring, and of the things that the money would bring back in civilization. Added to what he had so far managed to save, his share would make almost enough to start a fox breeding ranch, or a mink ranch. Almost enough, but not quite. That meant he would have to spend another winter in this location, and Hager flinched at the thought. He hated loneliness and the bitter sub-zero cold. Most of all, he hated the cold. Only a fur breeding ranch, with large, warm living quarters, would have made it bearable. Hager didn't know when the idea came to him. It must have been lying dormant for a long time in a far, dark corner of his mind, only now surging to the fore. Subconsciously, he must have prepared himself for this moment of inspiration. He wasn't sure. He was aware only of an interval while he plodded behind the sled, drawn by the struggling and panting team, cursing the dogs, cursing Cahill, and the fierce cold that mischievously searched out the most tender portions of his face beneath the hood of his parka. There was that moment, and then he found himself toying with the thought of murdering Cahill. With the other out of the way, the entire proceeds from the sale of furs would be his. There would be no necessity to split. He could start the fur ranch at once. He wouldn't have to spend another winter in this vicious cold. A dozen fascinating new possibilities opened up to Hager. It was as though he had been blind and was able to see only now. Breathtaking vistas blossomed before his awakened eyes. There was music in what he visioned, music and the voices of women, bright lights, color, movement, and the warmth of gentler climes. The brightest part of the picture was that Cahill's death need not be outright murder. The man was sick. His life depended on getting him into the hands of the doctor in Moose Gulch as quickly as possible. If Hager were simply to delay in reaching the settlement, Cahill would die as surely as though from the thrust of a knife or the impact of a bullet. Exposure to the biting cold would finish him. And nobody would know. Hager could always claim that he had hurried as best he could under the difficult, hampering circumstances of the storm, but that Cahill had died on the way. As easy as that. If Marshal Art Maddox stuck his long nose into the matter, Cahill's unmarked body would be proof that there had been no foul play. Hager felt satisfied that his scheme was without loopholes. The idea had become a definite plan. And now his square lips hardened with determination behind the scarf. He looked at Cahill, dozing feverishly on the shed, with deep-set gray eyes that were bleak and implacable. Cahill would never reach Moose Gulch alive. With his grim purpose giving new drive to his actions, Hager glanced about him. It was difficult to see through the curtain of snow that hung between him and the landscape, but by squinting steadily through momentary rifts made by the frigid, lashing wind, he was able presently to discern that they were near the pass leading out of the valley. Beyond the pass, he knew, was a forest, dipping down to the banks of a frozen stream. The stream ran for several miles until it branched into a river, which in turn led directly into Moose Gulch. With these landmarks to guide him, a traveler through the snow-bound wilderness could reach the settlement easily and quickly. But Hager didn't intend to do that. He now had time to kill. He chuckled darkly over the accuracy of the phrase. Plodding toward the pass, he deliberately slowed his steps. He no longer used the whip or shouted at the dogs for greater speed. The animals were grateful for the respite. They slackened their pace, tongues lolling and bushy tails waving as they bobbed in their plowed path through the white drifts. Cahill dozed on. Once or twice, he moved restlessly amid the furs piled about him. It was as if though some deep, vague instinct warned him that something was wrong. Hager watched the other sharply for a time, then desisted to give his attention to maneuvering the sled through the pass. The forest appeared, the trees wraith-like under their thick, white mantles of snow. Hager didn't follow the dip in the land that led toward the frozen stream. He guided the dogs in the opposite direction and began watching Cahill again. He hoped that the man would not awake until less familiar territory surrounded them. Cahill didn't awake. He dozed and tossed, his lips moving occasionally in a soundless mutter. His gaunt, leathery face was pale under its growth of grizzled whiskers. The snow-covered land rose, became rocky and difficult. The dogs began laboring with increasing weariness in their efforts to keep pulling the heavy sled. Hager realized he couldn't go in this direction much longer. When a ravine suddenly presented itself, relatively free of snow, he decided to call a halt. Unfastening the dogs, he left the ravine and began searching through the snow for brushwood. It took time, but Hager was in no hurry. He gathered an armful and finally returned to the sled. Cahill was awake. He had propped himself feebly among the furs, his gaunt face blank and drab with sickness. His filmed blue eyes fastened on Hager. "Water," he whispered. "Water, Matt." "Coming up," Hager said. "Just you wait a minute, Ben, and you'll get all the water you want." Cahill fell back among the furs, and Hager leisurely shaved kindling and stacked the wood and then set it ablaze. The ravine was shielded from the wind, and the wood ignited without difficulty. At last, Hager went to the sled and removed the small pack he had fortunately thought to bring along. His experience with the wilderness had trained him never to overlook the smallest precautions. Hager took a handled pan from the pack. He filled it with the snow and then held the pan over the flames. When the snow melted, he filled a tin cup with the liquid and went over to Cahill. He had to steady the cup as the other drank. Finally, Cahill nodded. His eyes seemed to clear. He glanced about him, and a dim worry moved in his face. "Matt, where are we?" "Somewhere near Boot Valley." You mean we're lost?" "I sort of got mixed up in the storm. Nothing to worry about." Cahill shivered suddenly. "We've got to reach town, Matt. Got to see the doctor." Hager nodded. "How do you feel?" "It's getting worse. I can feel it getting worse. I'm cold now, Matt. Before I was—" Cahill's voice trailed off. He had to make an effort before he was able to speak again. Got to see the doctor, Matt. Can't waste any time." "I know," Hager said. "But the team needs a little rest. They've had a lot of heavy hauling, and there's still a distance to go." Cahill nodded miserably, shivering. He burrowed into the furs, still shivering, breathing rapidly through parted lips. Slowly the chill left him. His eyes clouded again. Then his lids fell, and he dozed once more. Hager brewed tea and drank it slowly, squatting before the fire. Then he packed and lighted his pipe. He stared into the flames with narrowed eyes, seeing his dreams pictured there. They were pleasant dreams. Hager remained in the ravine until the supply of wood was gone. Then he fastened the dogs back into their traces and resumed his position behind the sled. With shouts and cracks of the whip, he guided the animals out of the ravine, following the downward slope of the land this time. The snow stopped falling after a while, but the wind and the cold increased. The cold hung on the air like an enormous, transparent weight. Somehow it seemed to give an impossible crystalline purity to the snow blanketing the trees and the land. In doing so, it emphasized and magnified its very presence. It made itself something almost alive and sentient, icily malignant, overbearing, utterly cruel and without mercy. Hager cursed the cold with redoubled venom. Despite the thickness of his fur parka and the layers of clothing beneath, the cold seemed to soak into him like an all-penetrating liquid. He had to wave his arms and stamp his feet to fight back a creeping numbness. But the terrible chill could not subdue the flame of purpose burning in Hager's mind. That part of him remained keenly alert. The sled was moving in the direction of the stream, and he was careful to judge the distance carefully. He didn't want to approach too close. At just the right moment, he turned the sled at angle back toward the way from which it had come. It was his plan to keep zigzagging, approaching the stream and then retreating, always at a tangent. A great deal of time would be consumed in this way, with very little actual forward progress toward Moose Gulch. He repeated this maneuver again and again. Cahill roused a few times to inquire weakly about their progress. Always, Hager gave the same answer. "We're getting there, Ben. It won't be long now. Don't you worry." After that, Cahill was silent. It seemed evident to Hager that the man was sinking rapidly. But not as rapidly as Hager wished. He knew he couldn't bear the paralyzing cold much longer, and his hatred of it grew. The sled reached a group of slab-like rock outcroppings that offered shelter from the slashing wind. Hager stopped the sled behind their protection for a short rest. The additional delay suited his plans. While the dogs huddled together in the snow, Hager went around the sled to get the pack. He glanced at Cahill's face, and his muscles became tense. Cahill's eyes were open. Cahill was watching him with a terrible steadiness and a soul-searing clarity. Cahill knew. Hager realized that Cahill must have been awake for quite some time, watching the actions of the sled. The man had clearly discovered Hager's deception. Hager felt transfixed by the accusing brightness in the other's eyes. He sensed that his guilt was written vividly and unmistakably in his face. He fumbled for words that would form an excuse, an apology, some sort of plausible lie, anything that would remove the dreadful knowledge in Cahill's eyes. But no words came. After a strained, bitter moment, Cahill spoke. His voice was low, yet somehow curiously distinct. "You're trying to kill me, Matt. I see it now. You aren't going straight toward Moose Gulch. You're tracking back and forth to waste time. You want me to die." "That isn't true," Hager blurted. I got lost. The storm and the cold got me mixed up." Cahill went on as though he hadn't heard. "It's the furs, isn't it, Matt? You want all the money for yourself. With me out of the way, you won't have any trouble." "I got mixed up, I tell you," Hager insisted. Cahill said nothing further. With a burst of energy as sudden as it was amazing, he gripped the sides of the sled and began pushing himself erect. His strangely clear eyes were fixed on Hager. Mastering a brief surge of panic, Hager threw himself forward, forcing Cahill back into the sled. Cahill struggled a moment, but the reserve strength he had managed to summon quickly gave out. He fell back into the sled and lay limp and quiet, his eyes closed, breathing harshly and rapidly. Hager watched for several minutes, the cold creeping slyly into him with the inactivity. Then, assured that Cahill would make no further trouble, he obtained the pack. He fed the dogs this time, tossing them pieces of dried meat. They would need renewed strength and energy to take him the remaining distance to Moose Gulch. Finally, gathering brushwood, Hager built a small fire and brewed tea. He ate a couple of thick sandwiches as he drank the tea, chewing with methodic slowness and glancing at Cahill. The other hadn't stirred since making his accusation. But when Hager finished eating, Cahill's eyes opened once more. He looked at Hager for a long, breathless moment. Only a vestige of the unnatural brightness that had been in his eyes remained now. With what must have required a tremendous effort, he spoke. "You aren't going to get away with this, Matt. I'm going to get you. I'm going to make you pay." A moment longer Cahill looked at Hager, and then the last remnant of brightness left his eyes. His lids fell slowly. He looked exhausted and seemed to be resting. But several minutes later, acting on a sudden realization, Hager felt for Cahill's pulse and found that the man was dead. Triumph spread through Hager like a heady warmth. It was over. The money from the furs would be his alone. He would have the fur ranch now. But there was no hurry about that. He would travel a little first and have some fun. The best part of it was that he would never have to worry. Cahill's body was completely unmarked. It was very obvious that he had died of illness. There couldn't possibly be any suspicions. Then Hager recalled the threat Cahill had made before dying. Cahill had promised revenge, but there was nothing he could do now. Hager shrugged the memory away. The dead were dead. They could do no harm. Hager now lost no time in reaching Moose Gulch. He drove the dogs relentlessly, trotting behind the sled. Elation gave him a strength that took him easily over the miles. A short time before he entered the settlement, it began to snow again. Hager was pleased. The snow would cover up the tracks he had left in the event that Art Maddox did any snooping. He went directly to the doctor's home, carrying the body of Cahill inside. He cleverly played the part of a man reluctant to believe that his partner had died. "Isn't there something you can do, Doc?" he asked anxiously. "Maybe it isn't too late." The other straightened from his examination of Cahill and shook his white thatch. His round, ruddy features were sympathetic. "I'm afraid it's all over. Ben Cahill's as dead as he'll ever be. Most likely he passed away some time before you were able to reach town. Nothing left to do now but turn him over to the undertaker. That's me, in case you don't know. In Moose Gulch, it takes 2-3 jobs to keep a man fairly busy." Hager sighed and looked properly grief-stricken. "Well, I'll leave you to take care of things, Doc. Do a good job. Nothing but the best, you know. Ben was the finest partner a man could ever have." Hager left and proceeded to visit acquaintances in the settlement, spreading the news of Cahill's death. He was showered with condolences, which he accepted with a suitable air of melancholy. Later, eating supper in the tiny dining room of Moose Gulch's small frame hotel, he was joined at the table by Art Maddox. The marshal was a tall, raw-boned man with a long nose and protruding eyes that looked deceptively mild. His presence filled Hager with a vague dread. "Heard Ben Cahill took sick and died while you were bringing him into town," Maddox began. "Sure is too bad. How did it happen?" Hager explained, adhering closely to essential facts, though he omitted certain others and stretched a point here and there. He finished, "I tried to get Ben into town as fast as I could, but it was snowing hard, and I almost got lost a couple of times. Ben was sick bad, and with the cold and all, he died on the way." "It kind of looks like you expected that to happen," Maddox said. Hager grew tense. "What do you mean?" "The way you took the furs along kind of makes it look like you expected Ben Cahill to die. Besides, you ought to have known that the furs would slow you down on the trip to town." "I was afraid to leave the furs at the cabin," Hager defended. "Suppose somebody stole them while me and Ben were gone. A whole season's catch. I just couldn't take a chance." Maddox nodded with evident reluctance. "That's true enough, I guess. I was just sort of wondering about it." He stood up. "Well, sorry to have bothered you." Hager made a generous gesture. No bother at all." He watched as Maddox left the room, grinning inwardly. Maddox apparently suspected something in his snooping, suspicious way, but the only point of attack he'd been able to find was one for which Hager had a satisfactory explanation. Hager felt certain that he wouldn't be questioned again, and with the snow blotting out the erratic trail the sled had left, he was confident that he had nothing to fear from Maddox any longer. The grin crept out around his square lips. He was safe. He had committed the perfect crime. Hager checked in at the hotel, and after a pleasant evening spent at one of Moose Gulch's 2 saloons, he returned and went to bed. He had a restless night. The hotel was warm enough, and the covers on the bed thick, but a strange feeling of cold seemed to envelop him. And though he emptied the bottle of whiskey he had brought with him, the cold persisted. He slept fitfully. Once he dreamed that he was tied, naked to the sled, and being driven by Cahill through a terrific snowstorm. The cold was so intense it seared him like fire. He awoke shivering, a vivid recollection of Cahill's gaunt, accusing features in his mind. Again he seemed to hear Cahill's dying promise. "You aren't going to get away with this, Matt. I'm going to get you. I'm going to make you pay." And now, shuddering with that weird cold that seemed to enclose him like a huge, vengeful fist, Hager wondered. The cold remained with him in the days that followed. It not only remained, it grew more unbearable. Hager began to have a persecuted feeling. The cold stayed with him wherever he went. Even near hot stoves or in heated rooms, he felt chilled. No one else seemed to notice it. The cold seemed intended for him alone. More and more, he wondered about Cahill's threat. He was materialistic. He didn't believe in ghosts. But he knew that he was being haunted by an unnatural cold that nobody else seemed able to feel. He cast about for a method of escaping the cold. The obvious solution was to leave Moose Gulch, as he had intended all along. In his mind, the cold was somehow connected with the settlement, through Cahill, who was buried there. A trip to one of the warm southern regions in the States, he decided, should bring relief. He sold the furs, and with the money took passage on a plane that operated between the settlement and a large town some distance away. Continuing to travel by plane, he presently arrived in Seattle. Still, the cold remained with him. The miles he had put between Moose Gulch and himself hadn't done any good. Nothing seemed to help. Heavy clothes, nourishing foods, whiskey, vigorous exercise. Nothing brought him the warmth he was beginning to crave as an addict craves dope. Desperately, he resumed his trip, traveling by air and then by train, and finally grasping at any means of transportation that happened to be most convenient. The cold traveled with him. It enveloped him like a shell. It was an invisible prison, shutting him away from the world of warmth. The climate grew increasingly mild and balmy as he progressed southward, but the chill that always surrounded him grew worse. More often now he thought of Cahill's grim promise. "I'm going to get you. I'm going to make you pay." It repeated itself over and over in his mind. It was emphasized by the invisible blanket of cold wrapped inescapably about him. Once, in a hotel room where he had been drinking steadily, Hager's despair rose in him to the point of madness. He leapt from the bed, hurling an empty whiskey bottle against the wall, screaming mingled curses and entreaties. "Damn you, Cahill! Leave me alone! Haven't you had enough? How much longer are you going to keep torturing me? Leave me alone, do you hear? Leave me alone!" Cahill didn't seem to hear, or if he did, he paid no attention. The cold stayed. Hager began to lose weight. His stocky figure became gaunt, his cheeks sunken. Dark hollows cupped his feverishly bright eyes. His hands trembled. He jerked nervously at sudden noises. In Los Angeles, he yielded to a wild impulse and visited a doctor. He explained his symptoms, omitting their true cause, and pleaded for help. The doctor gave him a complete physical examination, though it was evident from the man's expression of perplexity that he had learned nothing. "I can't understand it," he told Hager. "There's nothing seriously wrong with you. All you need is plenty of food and rest. You're probably just imagining things." Hager groaned, paid his bill, and fled. Several days later found him in Mexico. It was warm, but he didn't feel it. He knew with a terrible certainty that he would never feel warmth again. And he was tired of futilely trying to escape something from which there was no escape. He rented a small house on the outskirts of a town far from the border, and hired an elderly Mexican named Pancho to attend to his needs. Pancho was a good servant, but he was evidently greatly puzzled by Hager. According to the stories Pancho told his cronies in the town, his gringo master insisted that a hot fire be kept going constantly in the fireplace, and in this warm weather, too. And if that alone wasn't enough, the gringo also kept himself wrapped thickly in blankets. It was all very strange. The gringo, he said, was being tormented by a demon. The people of the town, a simple folk to whom the supernatural was as real as the sun in the sky, were sympathetic. A priest at the church promptly volunteered his aid. He had, as Pancho subsequently explained to Hager when he appeared with the man, an enviable reputation for his skill in exorcising devils and evil spirits. Hager seized at the hope. He clutched at the priest eagerly. "Try it. Pray for me. Do something. Anything." The priest nodded gravely and began his task. It worked. Hager felt warm again. A wild delight filled him. For the first time he became aware that the room was stifling, but the mere fact that he was able to feel it seemed the most wonderful thing in the world. He had a sense of freedom as complete as though he had been released into the sunlight after long confinement in a lightless dungeon. He wrung the priest's hand, forced money on him, and then told Pancho he was throwing a fiesta for the entire town that evening. Pancho was to take care of the details immediately. No expense was to be spared. For the rest of the day, Hager soaked himself in the sunlight, reveling in the delicious warmth. And when evening came, he attended the fiesta in high spirits. He ate tortillas, drank wine, and danced with innumerable dark-eyed señoritas. It was late when he returned to the house with Pancho. He found a robed figure waiting patiently at the door. It was the priest. Something about the man's solemn expression filled Hager with dread. "What's the matter?" he demanded. "Has something happened?" In his halting English, Pancho translated the gist of the priest's explanation. "The padre say he no can help you, senor. He say he have how you call vision. It tell him you must pay." There was more, but Hager didn't need any more to know that he was being refused further help for the crime he had committed. A short while after the priest left, he felt the cold again. Pancho built a fire in the fireplace, and Hager crouched before it, huddled in blankets and shivering. He was still there when Pancho went to bed. And he was still there when Pancho awoke in the morning. But he was no longer shivering. He no longer felt the cold. He was dead. It had been a warm night. The fire had been hot, the blankets numerous and thick. Yet Hager had frozen to death. The End of Cold Ghost by Chester S. Geyer.